In the early winter of 2002, in a quiet Pittsburgh neighborhood where families trusted familiar routines, a 13-year-old girl stepped into the digital world and vanished without a sound. Her disappearance left no broken door, no witness, and no clear path. How could an ordinary home become the beginning of a long and unseen journey? The Kozakiewicz family lived in such a neighborhood where most people recognized one another, and evenings were usually quiet. Their home, like many in the area, was arranged around a shared sense of routine. Dinner around the same time, parents nearby, and their daughter Alicia often seated at the computer, chatting with classmates or playing simple online games. She was 13, slight in build with long hair that she rarely styled, a gentle voice, and a way of moving that suggested she preferred to observe before speaking. Teachers described her as polite and thoughtful. Her parents saw her as responsible, a child who avoided risks and rarely asked for much. The internet, however, was becoming a more private part of her world. At first, Alicia used it as most children did, typing messages in public chat rooms and visiting safe websites approved by adults. Over time, she grew more comfortable with online conversations, and her parents, trusting her nature, did not hover. The family computer sat in the living room so that everything could be seen, yet the hours after midnight offered their own privacy. Her parents often went to sleep early, especially during holiday periods, and Alicia remained awake longer, chatting quietly with someone she believed to be a friend. That friend called herself Christine, a girl who claimed to be roughly Alicia's age. For nearly a year, the two exchanged messages about school, music, and frustrations that felt easier to share with someone who seemed to understand. Alicia gradually learned that Christine was not who she claimed to be. The tone of the conversations shifted, and a new person appeared, an adult man, older, patient, and persistent. Instead of ending contact, Alicia continued speaking with him. To her young mind, the transition felt confusing, yet she did not recognize the danger. The man, later identified as Scott Tyree, presented himself as someone who cared about her, someone who listened. As 2001 turned into 2002, the Kozakiewicz household prepared for New Year's celebrations. Relatives visited earlier in the day, and by evening the family had settled into a familiar calm. Outside, the streets were quiet. Few cars passed, and most homes showed only a few lights through their windows. Alicia seemed unchanged from usual, moving around the house without any sign of distress. She joined her family briefly during the late evening, then returned to her room and later to the computer. Just before midnight, her parents recall hearing faint movement near the back of the house, but thought little of it. Alicia had always been trustworthy, and no one imagined that she would leave the home without permission. Records later show that at some point between 11 p.m. and midnight, she received a message instructing her to meet outside, only steps from the house. The weather was cold, typical for Pittsburgh in January, and the streets were empty except for the glow of a few porch lights. Alicia opened the back door quietly and stepped out, wearing simple clothes and no coat thick enough for the temperature. She walked along the narrow path toward the small parking area behind the neighboring houses. A camera, operated by a neighbor who worked late shifts and kept security equipment for personal use, captured a brief, grainy image of a tall figure approaching her. The man led her toward a vehicle that had been parked in a shadowed corner of the lot. Alicia did not resist. She followed him as though continuing a conversation already familiar. Inside the house, her parents slept, unaware that their daughter had just left the place where she had always been safest. The minutes passed quietly until her mother woke around 11:40 p.m., sensing that the lights in the living room were still on. She walked through the hallway, expecting to find Alicia at the computer or dozing on the couch. Instead, the chair was empty, The computer screen dimmed, and the back door was unlocked. She called for her daughter, first calmly, then with rising confusion. After searching every room and checking outside the house, she alerted her husband, and both began calling neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Alicia. By midnight, they were certain she was gone. The police were notified shortly after, and officers arrived to take statements. At that early hour, there was little they could do beyond searching the immediate area, shining flashlights down the alleys and checking nearby yards. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints that could be traced, and no indication that Alicia had been forced to leave. Everything suggested that she had walked out on her own, yet nothing in her history supported that idea. Her parents repeated the same detail again and again. Alicia always stayed inside at night, always told them where she was going, and never met strangers. By 2 a.m., officers suspected that the disappearance was not a simple case of teenage impulsiveness. The unlocked door, the uncharacteristic absence, and the sudden break from routine all pointed to an event that had occurred quickly and quietly. When the officers examined the family computer, they found open message windows and chat applications that Alicia had used earlier in the night. Nothing immediately revealed who she had been talking to, but investigators noted the pattern of late-night conversations and the possibility that an online acquaintance might be involved. Morning arrived with no new information. The neighborhood, usually friendly and predictable, felt unnervingly silent. For the Kozakiewicz family, the first hours of the new year carried only uncertainty. There were no calls, no sightings, no clues beyond the evidence inside the home. The last confirmed image of Alicia was the brief, indistinct footage from the neighbor's camera. A young girl stepping out of the frame, following someone taller, moving toward a place no one could clearly see. From that moment on, no one in her family saw her again. The hours following Alicia's disappearance moved with a strange combination of urgency and uncertainty. In a quiet Pittsburgh neighborhood where evening routines rarely changed, the sudden absence of a 13-year-old girl forced the community into a state of alert. Her parents contacted authorities shortly after midnight, when it became clear that she had not simply stepped outside or fallen asleep in another room. Officers arrived, took statements, and began the slow, methodical work of reconstructing the last moments when Alicia had been seen. At this stage, there was no clear sign of struggle, no forced entry, and no witness capable of describing anything out of place. That absence of clear evidence immediately turned the investigation toward the digital world, an environment where young teenagers in the early 2000s were increasingly spending their time, often without fully understanding the risks that came with it. Detectives reviewed the layout of the family home, and were particularly interested in the computer placed in the living room. It was positioned openly, a choice meant to keep online activity within view of the household. Yet officers noted that the computer's activity logs showed extended late-night conversations, often occurring when the rest of the family was asleep. In the early stages of the inquiry, investigators simply documented this detail without drawing conclusions, but it became an important thread in the broader picture of Alicia's life in the months leading to her disappearance. Her parents cooperated closely, offering access to every device, every email, and every saved file, even though reviewing them brought visible distress. While the digital review was underway, the search on the ground expanded. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents whether they had noticed unusual vehicles or unfamiliar individuals passing through the area during the evening hours. Patrol units followed routes commonly used by teenagers walking outside, and nearby parks were checked in case Alicia had attempted to meet a friend. Search dogs were brought in, but the trail ended quickly near the edge of the property, suggesting she had entered a vehicle rather than run off on foot. That detail became the first quiet shift in the investigation. the possibility that she had been persuaded or coerced into leaving, instead of wandering away on her own. By the morning of January 2nd, local news had begun distributing Alicia's photo. Officers noted that this step often prompted a wave of tips, some useful, some misleading. But in cases involving minors, it was essential. Expected, calls began to arrive at the station, most reporting potential sightings that could not be verified or referencing online rumors. Detectives sorted through each lead with patience, aware that even a misinterpreted detail might connect to something later. As the family waited for updates, investigators continued to work through Alicia's digital communications, gradually uncovering a pattern that hinted at long-term contact with someone who had gained her trust. Before any definitive conclusions could be shared, an unexpected development occurred. A viewer several states away reported seeing a girl online who resembled Alicia. The person contacted authorities anonymously, fearing involvement in something dangerous but unable to ignore what they had witnessed. The call came through a payphone, adding another layer of uncertainty. The information provided included a screen name and vague references to a live video stream that had shown a distressed young girl. At this stage, investigators could not be certain the caller was reliable, but they understood that cases involving online contact could change direction quickly. The lead was marked high priority. Cybercrime specialists joined the investigation and worked to trace the username provided by the anonymous caller. They navigated through digital paths common at the time: chat logs, account registrations, connection histories, and slowly narrowed the origin of the activity. The process was careful and deliberate. In the early 2000s, online tracing required multiple steps and coordination across service providers. After several hours of cross-checking data, agents obtained an IP address linked to a townhouse in Herndon, Virginia, hundreds of miles from Pittsburgh. This discovery introduced the first concrete point on the map since Alicia had vanished. A decision had to be made. The evidence was not yet confirmed, but the situation involved a minor, and timing was crucial. The FBI joined local authorities in preparing a coordinated response, while investigators revisited the anonymous caller's statements to gather every detail that might support action. Officers in Pittsburgh kept close contact with Alicia's family, explaining that a lead had been found, but refraining from giving false hope. For them, the uncertainty was oppressive, but they remained composed, trusting the investigators' judgment. Meanwhile, the townhouse in Herndon was placed under discreet observation. Agents noted no unusual activity from the outside, no sounds, and nothing visible through the windows. The quiet nature of the property could have meant nothing, or it could have indicated that someone inside was deliberately maintaining silence. After reviewing the accumulated data, the decision was made to execute a search. The priority was clear: locate Alicia, confirm her condition, and prevent any further harm. On January 4th, the operation began. Agents approached the townhouse cautiously, aware that forcing an entry into a residential space required precise coordination. The door was breached, and officers moved inside. The interior was dim, with the narrow layout typical of row homes in that region. In the basement, agents found a locked area that showed signs of being used recently. When the door opened, they discovered Alicia, restrained and disoriented but conscious. She hesitated at first, unsure whether the people confronting her were rescuers or another threat. That brief moment of uncertainty was noted by responders, forming one of the earliest indications of the psychological impact she had endured. Alicia was safely removed from the house and taken for medical evaluation, while other agents secured the scene and collected evidence. The suspect, who was not at home during the rescue, was arrested shortly afterward at his workplace. The investigation had shifted entirely. From a search for a missing girl to the collection of evidence for a federal case involving interstate abduction facilitated through digital grooming. By the end of the day, Alicia had been confirmed safe under protective supervision, and her parents were notified under controlled conditions to prevent a media surge. The earliest stage of the investigation had reached its conclusion, but the broader legal and psychological journey was only beginning. In the days immediately following Alicia's rescue, the pace of activity around the investigation was intense, but as weeks passed, the case naturally shifted from emergency response to long-term evaluation. Law enforcement agencies focused on preparing evidence for federal prosecution, while Alicia and her family entered a period marked by recovery rather than public visibility. For investigators, the urgency of the rescue gave way to quieter, more technical tasks, cataloging digital logs, analyzing equipment seized from the suspect's home, and coordinating interstate legal procedures. The early clarity of the rescue gradually transitioned into the complex, lingering questions that follow any major case involving a minor. This period formed the beginning of what many later described as the quiet years, not because the case was forgotten, but because the most sensitive work occurred behind closed doors. During this time, Alicia remained under structured medical care. Physicians monitored her physical condition, which stabilized quickly, but the psychological toll required careful attention. Professionals noted that her recollection of events was fragmented, a common consequence of extreme traumatic exposure. Meanwhile, her family adjusted to new routines that were shaped by caution and the need to protect her privacy. In Pennsylvania, her parents communicated regularly with federal authorities to understand the next steps, but even with consistent updates, they struggled with the abrupt shift from crisis to an uncertain calm. Investigators observed that the family moved between relief and quiet anxiety, aware that the legal process would take months, if not years. As the case progressed, the suspect remained in custody, and federal prosecutors prepared charges based on the evidence retrieved from the home. At this stage, the investigation no longer involved searches or public alerts. Instead, it depended on analysts, legal experts, and technicians. The digital materials seized during the rescue required extensive review to determine the scope of the suspect's online activity. Every file, device, and log had to be examined, not only to support the upcoming trial, but also to ensure no other victims were involved. This methodical examination took time, and the absence of daily developments led the community to settle into a slower, reflective phase. However, Alicia's case did not fade from public attention entirely. The early 2000s marked a period when online communication platforms were rapidly expanding, yet public understanding of digital risks remained limited. As reporters revisited the case, it became a reference point for discussions about online safety. News segments looked back at the circumstances of her disappearance and rescue, not as breaking updates, but as reminders of how easily minors could be exposed to unseen threats. Law enforcement agencies across several states quietly adopted new internal guidelines, influenced by lessons drawn from the investigation, and officers who worked the case later remarked that Alicia's file became an informal teaching model for identifying digital grooming patterns. For the family, however, the public conversation created mixed emotions. They understood the educational value of sharing their experience, but they also needed space to rebuild. Alicia's return home brought moments of reconnection, yet recovery was not a simple return to life before January 1st. Investigators noticed that the family home adopted new routines intended to create a sense of stability. Alicia resumed her schooling through supervised arrangements, though she was shielded from media contact. Professionals involved in her care suggested that memory gaps could persist indefinitely, a reality that her parents accepted with quiet resolve. Even as the case moved forward legally, one aspect remained notably absent: a clear prediction of long-term impact. That uncertainty extended to investigators as well. They had seen many cases in which the initial rescue did not mark the end of challenges, and they approached the following months with the understanding that support would need to continue well beyond the courtroom. Several officers maintained discreet communication with the family, ensuring that updates about the suspect's custody and court dates were delivered sensitively. That slow, consistent support became a defining feature of the aftermath. The legal proceedings advanced steadily. Prosecutors completed their review of the digital evidence and prepared their presentation for federal court. Although the charges were serious, the untold process itself adhered strictly to established procedure without dramatic developments. When the sentencing finally took place, it confirmed what investigators had anticipated: a long federal term reflecting the severity of the crime. With that outcome, the most active phase of law enforcement involvement concluded. For many cases, this stage marks the point when a file transitions into archival status. Yet Alicia's case did not settle into quiet obscurity. Instead, it became something of a catalyst. As the years passed, the broader dialogue around online safety grew louder, and Alicia gradually became an important voice in that conversation. The shift from victim to advocate did not occur suddenly. It began with small steps: discussions with psychologists, meetings with safety organizations, and invitations from schools seeking guidance. Each step marked a departure from the early period when her case was handled with strict privacy. Investigators who once searched for her now saw her speaking publicly about the very dangers she had survived, turning a personal ordeal into structured education. The cold case years, traditionally characterized by silence, were different in this instance. Rather than a dormant file left unsolved, this case evolved into a foundation for reform and awareness. Agencies introduced specialized training modules using insights from the investigation, focusing on how subtle digital interactions can escalate without visible signs at home. Parents across the country revisited household rules about internet use, and lawmakers began exploring legislation that would later be associated with Alicia's name. During this period, the case remained active, not as an open investigation, but as an enduring reference point. By the time several years had passed, Alicia's life had changed once again. She pursued her education, entered professional training, and eventually built the expertise needed to contribute formally to discussions about child safety. From an investigative perspective, her involvement in advocacy became one of the most significant outcomes of the case. The initial years of uncertainty had developed into a long-term trajectory in which her voice held weight with both families and professionals. The cold case stage, therefore, wasn't defined by inactivity. It was defined by transformation. Within the family, within law enforcement, and within public understanding of online risks. Alicia's absence had once created a sudden void. Her return initiated a long process of rebuilding, and the subsequent years quietly reshaped how digital safety was discussed across the country. Several years after Alicia's rescue, investigators often looked back on the case as one that had been resolved with unusual speed. Yet as digital technology evolved and national discussions about online safety widened, new information from archived materials began to take on expanded meaning. What was once seen as a single criminal act now appeared to be an early example of a larger pattern that law enforcement had not fully recognized at the time. This gradual shift in understanding created renewed interest among investigators, analysts, and child safety experts who revisited key evidence to understand how the offender had operated and how similar cases might be prevented in the future. The re-examination began quietly. Federal analysts assigned to a new task force were reviewing past cases involving online communication, searching for clues that might help identify broader trends in digital grooming. Alicia's case resurfaced not because of unanswered questions, but because the digital trail had been unusually well preserved. Investigators now possessed more advanced tools capable of analyzing data that, in the early 2000s, had been difficult to interpret. When they reconstructed the timeline of communication, they observed patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Certain gaps in the chat logs indicated that the offender had alternated between multiple online identities. Some usernames appeared only briefly before disappearing entirely, while others resurfaced after months of inactivity. This raised the possibility that Alicia had been contacted through more channels than initially understood. These findings did not alter the outcome of the original legal process, but they revealed a level of planning that investigators at the time had not fully documented. The offender had used several layers of online presence, shifting between them to maintain control of the conversation. Analysts noted that these techniques resembled behaviors that would later become common among online predators: cycles of gaining trust, withdrawing contact to create anxiety, and then returning to strengthen influence. What Alicia experienced, late-night conversations, gradual disclosure of information, and the slow erosion of boundaries, now appeared to be part of a more structured pattern than previously recognized. The new analysis also highlighted another significant detail. The anonymous caller, whose tip had led to Alicia's rescue, had provided more valuable information than anyone realized at the time. Back then, investigators focused on the single username he shared. But when digital specialists re-examined the caller's statement, they discovered that the viewer had described certain visual elements that did not match the original account recorded during the operation. The differences were subtle: variations in camera positioning and background objects. Yet when compared to archived digital files, they suggested that the offender had changed the layout of his basement space multiple times during Alicia's captivity. This discovery triggered further review of the physical evidence collected during the raid. Photos taken at the time showed an arrangement that appeared consistent with the newer digital findings. Investigators realized that the offender had modified that part of the home repeatedly, perhaps to conceal evidence of earlier activity or to adjust the environment depending on who might be watching online. It was a detail that had been easy to overlook during the urgency of the rescue, but now it helped clarify how the offender operated. He was not acting impulsively. He was adapting his behavior based on the level of attention he expected. These insights were not merely academic. They demonstrated that early detection of online grooming required more than monitoring conversations. It required attention to patterns of behavior, inconsistencies, and the hidden signals that indicated a shift from conversation to manipulation. As this new understanding spread through law enforcement channels, Alicia's case was once again referenced in training modules, this time with added depth. The FBI incorporated the reanalyzed data into its educational materials for field agents, emphasizing early intervention in cases where minors engaged in unexplained, late-night communication. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also updated its guidelines, recommending that parents and schools watch for subtle shifts in a child's behavior, changes that could signal developing online influence. The turning point came when Alicia, now older and pursuing her education in psychology, reviewed parts of the newly interpreted evidence with investigators. Her insights brought another dimension to the case. She explained that she had not recognized the manipulation as danger because it had unfolded slowly and felt like a friendship at first. She remembered receiving messages at times when she felt lonely or stressed, and those moments of contact seemed supportive, not harmful. Her reflections provided investigators with a clearer understanding of how digital influence can occur long before any illegal act is committed. This input was invaluable. It offered a first-hand perspective that transformed the case from a sequence of events into a psychological outline of how grooming develops in real time. While the investigation did not reopen formally, there were no unresolved suspects and no indication of additional victims, the case evolved into a foundation for strategic changes across multiple fields. Law enforcement agencies used the findings to refine digital monitoring tools. Schools implemented updated safety programs. Nonprofit organizations began expanding their outreach efforts to teach families how to identify early signs of manipulative communication. Each shift traced its origin back to the new analysis, which revealed that Alicia's case had been a precursor to many modern challenges facing minors online. In the midst of these developments, a separate but significant discovery emerged. The review of archived network records revealed that another individual had observed Alicia online near the time of her disappearance, but had never reported it. This person was located and questioned years later, and although the information arrived too late to influence the investigation, it underscored an important truth. Public awareness is often the missing link in preventing harm. The contrast between the anonymous caller who acted immediately and the unidentified viewer who remained silent became a powerful lesson used in community training sessions. It demonstrated that even partial information, shared promptly, can alter the outcome of a crisis. For Alicia, this phase of renewed attention to her case coincided with her emerging role as an advocate. She often described the investigation's second life, the new findings, the updated methods, and the changes in safety protocols, as proof that her experience, however painful, had contributed to protecting others. Investigators noticed that she approached the discussions not from a place of fear, but from a steady, grounded determination to transform her past into guidance for families and law enforcement officers. Her involvement reinforced the central message of the case, that vigilance, awareness, and early intervention can prevent tragedies. By the end of this period, the new evidence had not changed the core facts of the original incident, but it had profoundly expanded the understanding of how it happened. The turning point was not marked by a single discovery, but by the accumulation of insights that clarified the broader landscape of online risk. Alicia's case, once viewed primarily as a singular crime, had become a blueprint for prevention. The case, fully resolved in the legal sense, now served a larger purpose, revealing patterns, informing policy, and shaping future safeguards for children navigating the digital world. As the investigation moved into its final legal stage, the sequence of events that had once been urgent slowly settled into a structured understanding of what had occurred. Prosecutors gathered the results of months of digital analysis, psychological evaluations, and forensic review, preparing to present a complete narrative in court. The factual foundation was strong. A minor groomed through digital communication, transported across state lines, and held in a hidden space inside a private residence. Yet the strength of the case did not come from dramatic revelations. Instead, it came from the steady accumulation of evidence, every digital message, every search pattern, every device log, that showed how the offense had been prepared and carried out. The courtroom phase marked the point when the truth needed to be presented in full detail. Investigators, now detached from the urgency of the rescue, walked through each step for the judge. They described the timing of the online conversations, the gradual pattern of influence, and the late-night messages that formed the early structure of manipulation. They outlined how the suspect had adjusted his communication style to maintain Alicia's attention, using reassurance at certain moments and silence at others. The court learned that such shifts were not random, but reflected a calculated method common among individuals seeking control over young users online. As each element was introduced, the case transformed from a series of isolated facts into a connected chain of actions. The defense presented very little beyond acknowledgement of the offender's involvement. Legal counsel requested leniency on the basis of his personal background, arguing that long-term isolation and emotional instability had driven his behavior. Prosecutors, however, emphasized that the planning demonstrated clarity rather than confusion. They pointed to details such as altered basement arrangements, changes in online identities, and the presence of tools used to restrict Alicia's movement. These were actions that required intention, not impulse. The court recognized this distinction, noting that deliberate preparation had preceded the offense. Alicia did not appear in court during the initial presentations, but a written statement was introduced on her behalf. It was brief, measured, and focused on facts rather than emotion. She described the sequence of events as she remembered them, though she acknowledged that certain details were incomplete due to memory gaps. The judge regarded her statement with attentive care, recognizing that the clarity of her words reflected both the impact of her experience and the progress she had made since returning home. For the investigators who had followed the case from the start, seeing her testimony, even in written form, served as a quiet reminder of the purpose behind every hour of work. The climax of the legal proceedings arrived during the sentencing hearing. Prosecutors presented their final overview, tying together all evidence, digital, physical, and testimonial. They reiterated the central truth. The offense was the result of long-term preparation, made possible through the offender's use of digital anonymity and his ability to conceal intentions behind casual conversation. In response, the defense repeated its request for consideration of the suspect's personal challenges, but the court found that these factors did not outweigh the seriousness of his actions. The judge reviewed the guidelines, the circumstances, and the psychological evaluations before delivering a statement that would define the final phase of the case. The ruling was clear. The offender received a federal sentence reflecting the full weight of the charges. There was no ambiguity, no deferred judgment, and no leniency. The structure of the sentence ensured that he would remain under strict supervision for decades, a decision meant to protect both the community and potential future victims. The courtroom remained quiet, as the judge emphasized that carefully planned exploitation could not be excused by personal struggles. The verdict provided closure on a legal level, even though emotional recovery would continue long after the court adjourned. After sentencing, investigators gathered in a private conference room to review the conclusion of the case. Many of them had worked on similar files before, yet they acknowledged that this one carried particular significance, not only because of the circumstances of the offense, but because of how much the investigation had contributed to national understanding of digital grooming. The lead agent noted that the case had highlighted the importance of quick response to online threats and the value of collaboration across agencies. In conversations that followed, they discussed how procedures had evolved since the early years of online communication and how future investigations would benefit from the lessons learned. The turning point for the case did not occur in the courtroom, however. It arrived afterward when Alicia emerged not simply as a recovered survivor, but as someone willing to describe her experience in order to prevent similar cases. Because she had begun to study psychology, her explanations offered a rare combination of lived experience and academic insight. She articulated how grooming had felt from the perspective of a 13-year-old, not as an obvious danger, but as a gradual shift in conversation tone, encouragement, and attention. This perspective allowed investigators to refine their understanding of early signs that might otherwise appear harmless. Shortly after the sentencing, Alicia met privately with a small group of detectives and child protection specialists. In this conversation, She described moments when she had sensed something was wrong, but felt unable to interpret it clearly. She noted that, at the time, she did not have the vocabulary to identify manipulation or coercion. This discussion became one of the most valuable contributions to the long-term impact of the case. It offered a direct, practical explanation of how online influence takes hold and why children may not immediately recognize it. The final truth of the case extended beyond the legal ruling. It demonstrated how digital contact can gradually override a child's judgment without any visible sign of danger at home. It revealed how a seemingly ordinary online interaction can progress into targeted influence when unnoticed. It also showed how a single anonymous tip, submitted by someone who did not know the family, became the decisive factor that allowed investigators to locate Alicia in time. As the legal process closed, the broader meaning of the case became clear. The rescue had prevented what could have become a far longer period of captivity. The reanalysis had transformed the case into a tool for training and prevention, and the sentencing provided a definitive answer to the central question of justice. The climax, therefore, was not a dramatic confrontation, but the steady, structured revelation of truth. How it happened, why it happened, and how similar cases could be detected earlier in the future. The sentencing marked a formal conclusion, but the legal aftermath required a separate and more deliberate phase. In cases involving minors, federal procedure demands detailed documentation of how the offense was carried out, its long-term impact, and the risk posed by the offender in any future circumstance. This meant that, despite the clarity of the court's decision, investigators and legal professionals continued to work in the background, ensuring that no detail remained unexamined. Files were reviewed, risk assessments updated, and interagency reports prepared for both federal and state databases. Quietly, the case transitioned from a rescue operation into a structured legal record. During this period, the court requested a full psychological evaluation of the offender, not to reassess guilt, but to understand the underlying factors behind his actions. The process included interviews, written assessments, and analyses of digital behavior patterns. The results confirmed what investigators already suspected. The actions had not been impulsive. They stemmed from a sustained period of online manipulation, reinforced by deliberate planning and careful monitoring of Alicia's habits. The evaluation noted that the offender's behavior demonstrated a high degree of control, making long-term supervision essential. This formal analysis became part of the final judgment, ensuring that future oversight, should it ever be necessary, would rely on documented evidence rather than interpretation. The court also reviewed the pre-sentencing report, which included statements from Alicia's family. These statements did not describe the events in emotional terms. Instead, they focused on the measurable impact on daily life, changes in routines, long-term medical needs, and shifts in the family's sense of safety. The judge acknowledged these documented effects, noting that any sentence had to reflect not only the offense, but the enduring consequences for the victim and her family. In federal cases, such clarity is essential. It ensures that judgment aligns with the actual experience of those affected. One significant aspect of this phase involved community safety assessments. The court needed to determine whether additional conditions were necessary beyond the sentence itself. Investigators provided detailed information regarding the offender's digital habits, the equipment seized from his residence, and the strategies he used online. This documentation supported the court's decision to impose strict monitoring conditions, even within the custodial environment. Restrictions on communication, technology use, and contact with minors were included as part of his long-term record, ensuring that even after incarceration, federal supervision would remain comprehensive. Another component of this stage involved addressing the concerns raised by Alicia's family regarding the offender's placement after sentencing. The family expressed unease about the possibility of the offender being housed in a facility near their home. Their statement emphasized that proximity could create psychological strain even if no direct contact occurred. The court reviewed this concern carefully, acknowledging that emotional safety is an important factor in cases involving minors. After evaluating available facilities, the court approved a placement far outside Pennsylvania, reducing the likelihood of any intersection between the family's daily life and the offender's future custodial arrangements. The case entered a new phase when an unexpected development occurred. The offender was later found to have violated the conditions of his supervised release following an early transition to a halfway house. The violation involved accessing restricted online material, a breach that reinforced the concerns outlined in the psychological evaluation. Law enforcement acted promptly, and the court revoked his release, returning him to federal custody. This incident served as a stark demonstration of why long-term supervision had been necessary. The judge issued an additional sentence, extending the offender's confinement and reaffirming the seriousness of any breach of conditions. For investigators, this event validated the findings that had emerged during the analysis phase of the case. Through this legal progression, Alicia remained informed. Though she did not participate directly in hearings, the family's attorney ensured that updates were delivered sensitively and without pressure. Alicia's primary focus during this time was education and recovery. Still, the legal process shaped the environment around her. Extended custody for the offender provided reassurance that her future would not be overshadowed by uncertainty. This assurance became a quiet but significant part of her return to normal life. While the legal system handled the technical aspects, advocacy groups began incorporating Alicia's case into national policy discussions. Her experience demonstrated how digital communication could bypass traditional safety boundaries, and lawmakers sought to reinforce protections for minors. As a result, several states, including Virginia, Texas, California, and Hawaii, adopted versions of Alicia's Law, which allocated dedicated funding for digital crime task forces. These legislative changes formed an indirect but powerful extension of the court's judgment. They strengthened prevention efforts, expanded investigative resources, and reaffirmed the legal system's responsibility to adapt to evolving digital environments. Over time, Alicia herself became increasingly involved in public discussions on safety. Watching her participate in hearings and conferences gave the case an unusual sense of continuity. She understood not only the facts of the investigation, but also the broader implications for families navigating the online world. Her public statements were calm, detailed, and grounded in psychological insight. She spoke not about fear, but about awareness, offering practical guidance for parents, children, and educators. Investigators who once searched for her now observed her as someone shaping national understanding of online safety. In the final legal documents, the court summarized its findings in precise language. The summary stated that the offender had used deception, digital influence, and calculated preparation to carry out the crime, that the victim's recovery required sustained support, and that long-term oversight of the offender was necessary to protect the public. This summary formed the closing chapter of the legal process. After it was filed, no further appeals were considered, and the case was formally sealed as resolved. What remained was the broader impact, an impact that extended far beyond the courtroom. The case informed policy, shaped safety programs, and strengthened investigative methods. Yet the most defining element of the legal conclusion was its clarity. The court had delivered a judgment that acknowledged the gravity of the offense, the strength of the evidence, and the long-term needs of the victim. It answered the central question of justice. The truth had been established, Responsibility had been assigned, and the law had responded with full weight and precision. In the years that followed the final sentencing, the noise around the case gradually faded from public attention, but its consequences continued to shape lives quietly and consistently. Alicia entered early adulthood carrying a past that had once been defined by danger, but she moved forward with a focus on education, routine, and steady recovery. As time passed, the public no longer viewed her solely as the subject of a high-profile investigation. Instead, she became recognized for her voice, her work, and her contribution to safety efforts across the country. For investigators who had followed the case from the beginning, watching this transition provided a sense of closure that the courtroom alone could not deliver. Alicia's early post-rescue years were marked by a gradual rebuilding of daily life. She resumed school with careful support from counselors, who worked to help her regain normal patterns of concentration and confidence. Her family established routines that balanced protection with independence. These routines were simple but essential: shared meals, structured study hours, and quiet evenings that restored the sense of stability the family had lost during the search and legal turmoil. Observers who remained close to the family noted that although the trauma had left certain gaps in memory and moments of hesitation, Alicia demonstrated a capacity for recovery that steadily strengthened over time. One of the most notable aspects of her healing process was her decision to pursue psychology, a field that allowed her to understand both her experience and the broader patterns of manipulation that affect young people online. Her studies provided her with the vocabulary and frameworks she once lacked, enabling her to analyze what had happened not only emotionally but intellectually. This educational foundation later supported her work in advocacy, transforming her into a resource not just for families, but for professionals seeking to understand the psychological mechanisms behind digital grooming. As Alicia grew older, she began participating in conferences, hearings, and public discussions. These appearances were not designed for publicity, but for education. She spoke in measured tones, offering insights grounded in lived experience rather than dramatic detail. Her message emphasized awareness, not fear, preparation, not panic. She explained how manipulation can appear harmless at first, and how early intervention can change the outcome of a situation long before it becomes dangerous. Her ability to describe the progression of influence from the perspective of a young user became one of the most impactful contributions to national online safety programs. Her advocacy work extended beyond speaking engagements. She helped refine the content of school safety curricula, assisted child protection organizations in updating training materials, and offered guidance to lawmakers crafting digital protection policies. Alicia's law, which provided targeted funding for digital crime task forces, became a central element of this broader effort. With her involvement, additional states adopted the legislation, strengthening their capacity to investigate digital crimes and rescue endangered minors. Each new adoption marked another step in transforming her personal experience into systemic protection for others. Meanwhile, the investigators who had first responded to the case continued their work in other areas, but many acknowledged that Alicia's story remained with them. In internal training sessions, they often referenced the importance of the anonymous tip, the speed of the operation, and the need for vigilance in monitoring online interactions. The case became a staple example of how coordinated communication across agencies can save a life, and how public awareness plays a critical role in missing child investigations. Some of the officers eventually retired, but they described the memory of the rescue as one of the clearest reminders of why they had chosen their profession. In the community where Alicia once lived, the case evolved into a long-term lesson about digital safety. Schools incorporated new policies, parents adjusted how they supervised online activity, and local organizations hosted safety workshops. These changes were quiet but meaningful, forming part of the long-term influence of the case. Over time, the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm, yet the awareness remained. A subtle but lasting shift toward caution and education. During these years, Alicia's personal life also stabilized. She maintained close relationships with her family, celebrated milestones, and experienced the typical challenges and successes of adulthood. Friends noted that she valued privacy, but also carried a calm determination when discussing issues related to safety and recovery. She continued therapy voluntarily, using it not as a response to crisis, but as a tool for personal growth. Her work in psychology provided her with a grounded perspective on healing, enabling her to support others while maintaining her own stability. The offender's continued imprisonment, including his later return to custody for violating release conditions, did not dominate her life, but it remained a distant reminder of the importance of strong supervision. Alicia did not follow every update or attend related hearings. Instead, she allowed legal authorities to manage the proceedings, trusting the system that had already demonstrated its commitment. This approach allowed her to focus on her career, relationships, and advocacy work without being drawn back into the emotional weight of past events. In time, Alicia's role expanded beyond public speaking. She became a consultant for training programs, a contributor to national discussions on data privacy, and a mentor for other survivors navigating the early stages of recovery. Those who worked alongside her often described her as steady, analytical, and deeply committed to improving safety protocols. Her contributions helped shape the conversation around how digital platforms should respond to reports of suspicious communication and how parents could support children without limiting their independence. The broader meaning of the case crystallized in this final phase. It was not solely a story of danger or rescue. It became a case study in awareness, prevention, and long-term resilience. It demonstrated how a single action, an anonymous tip, could alter the course of an entire investigation. It revealed how digital behavior leaves patterns that, when properly analyzed, can guide law enforcement toward timely intervention. And it showed how survivors, with the right support, can become powerful voices for change. The human meaning of the case became most evident in Alicia's own words. During a speech years later, she concluded with a statement that captured the journey from victim to advocate. Recovery is not about forgetting. It is about learning how to carry the past without letting it decide the future. That sentence became a quiet summary of the path she had walked, one marked by danger, rescue, legal judgment, and ultimately, purpose. The story closed not with uncertainty, but with a clear sense of direction. The investigation had reached its legal end, but its impact continued in every classroom, police department, and household that learned from it. The case reminded families to stay vigilant, encouraged officers to stay attentive, and offered survivors a vision of recovery defined not by limitations, but by strength. Through time, Alicia reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she helped create a safer path for others who might one day face similar risks. If you found this case reconstruction meaningful, consider supporting the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Share where you're watching from and what part of the story stayed with you. Your engagement helps bring more investigative narratives to life.